Yeah, there we are. Right, I didn't know what to title this actually, and house construction is just the simplest thing. But really what I'm trying to do here is to say what I do as a builder, usually being called in because we know a bit about energy and making buildings perform better, really. So that's the sort of thinking that I've got. But of course, you're dealing with existing structures with their own problems, which is what we've been dealing with in module 3, of course. So I'm going to stick mainly with the problems and what I will be looking out for when visiting, which might be able to be sorted while doing low energy measures, or they're just things that need doing anyway, despite what I've been called in to look at. So what I'm going to do is just run through a few projects which are different from different eras. So that will be the first thing. Now, funny enough, this isn't West Yorkshire. This is Bude, actually, down on the Cornish-Devon border. It's a brother of someone I know that lives next door to me, actually. So what I'd like to say is that a lot of these buildings, particularly the ancient ones, like this, which is probably 16th century, 17th century, or parts of it are, it probably had a thatch roof in the past. They go through many transformations. But on the whole, I'd be thinking, right, that is either built of stone and rubble or maybe cob with render. The windows will have probably been replaced, looking at them, maybe 100 years ago, something like that. But actually, it was in quite good nick. Notice the guttering, plastic guttering. That wouldn't have been original, or the soil and vent pipe, all add-ons, and I suspect the porch was as well. This is a house up in North Yorkshire, just to say there's nothing straightforward, nothing simple. It basically looks like something out of Charles Dickens, I know, with those bow windows. They're tricky to deal with, obviously. And I'm not sure actually what we did in the end, whether we took them out completely. But notice the brickwork on the gable end. You've got two types of brick there, probably behaving in two different ways. That was probably an extension which has the render on there in front of us. And then it goes to, because this house actually goes up to the second bay, if you like. And then we've got stonework. On the whole, this turned out to be a solid wall as such, or stone, rubble and stone. So no cavity. Now this is some very common here in West York, in sort of west of Huddersfield. And these are weavers' cottages. These were built around the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And they're all listed, grade 2. And we've got hundreds, if not thousands of them, actually. And you can see they were built to get as much light in as possible. These houses is where the cloth was made. This before the mills were built, actually. And you'll see that they've got all these stone mullions. All this stonework is quarried around the local area. The original stonework around here was grit stone, which was very hard. So anything that was built in the 18th century tended to be of a better quality than later. And the further you go into the 19th century, the worse the sandstone becomes, actually, in terms of weathering. Now we move on to later 19th century. This would have been a standard model of building, actually, all around the country, albeit our outer leaf is in stone. This would be brickwork elsewhere. Now, what they discovered, because the stone was so bad in this area, that they started building with cavities a lot earlier than other areas. So in the mid-19th century, what they started doing was having through stones to sort of bind the inner and outer leaf together. And at first, the inner leaf was stone, and the outer leaf obviously was in face stone, and then lime plasters inside. This was to stop the rain driving through the very porous sandstone, which it does, causing lots of problems, which I've known about for too many years. Now, this is exactly how it would have been built at the end of the 19th century, apart from the strap pointing. Now, originally it would have had lime mortar in there and a flush joint, but because lime mortar tends to be quite soft, it would wash out, and of course cement was invented around the Second World, not invented, but came into use after the Second World War. So they tried to sort of make them look smart, actually. But of course, we know now that the heavy cement pointing actually causes us problems. And you can see some of that stonework here is actually wearing away, it's being washed. And that is because of frost action, as well as frost action on the wet stone, which isn't helped by this heavy, strong mortar not allowing the water, the rainwater, to actually evaporate out. This is very common. Okay, and of course they aren't all straightforward. Look at this one over at Holm, near Holm Moss, where the Tour de France went last year. When I see this, it's okay in the sense that I know that that's going to be a cavity wall construction of this era. It'd be later 19th century. But look at that, the castle effect on top. That will mean internal gutters. That will mean trouble on the whole. Anything with internal valleys, internal gutter, lead work like this will invariably lead to ingress into the building at some point in the future. You can notice here a rainwater hopper, and that will be an outlet through the wall, letting the roof hopefully drain into it. Yeah, potentially trouble. Now, this is a standard one, terrace house around here. Quite interesting look, because we live in such a hilly situation, how they built the roof at an angle. Okay, and so the guttering is this is cast iron. This was standard around here, and is very robust actually, and a lot of it is still there. Stone chimneys, of course. This is the shared one. Well, they're not shared, that would be next door, of course. Again, look at the heavy strap pointing. The windows will have been replaced inevitably. They would have been sliding sashes at one point. But notice here they've got actually stone surrounds, which actually makes window fitting a lot easier, actually, because you've got very true openings. This is slightly later and probably into the beginning of the 20th century. And notice the window style here. They've actually gone for a casement, presumably some of the first ones, with the leaded light, single glazing. Then we even get posher ones. This is down in Edgerton in Huddersfield, for example. But again, look out for this situation. That's a flat roof in there. That will be lead work, probably butchered up with flash band and maybe black bitumen as they start to leak. Potential problems in this area here, and it looks to be like an internal guttering system. No, no, I can't tell. But anyway, different kettle of fish yet again. So a lot of these houses will have cellars, and I don't know if this is peculiar to this area or whether we've got it, but of course we've got a lot in London, I know. What are cellars for? They're usually very damp, and this is quite unusual. This one must be relatively dry because they've got cardboard boxes and books in, which aren't, it doesn't appear to be mouldy. have a look at the way the floor joists are built into the external wall, which in effect the ground level is something like the floor level outside. This is a big area, and I noticed this was the first question. Ben's question actually is about this area, which we'll talk about later. So here we have the steps going up from that particular cellar, I think. When I go into a house, I'm thinking, what is the thermal envelope? What are we trying to make relatively airtight and relatively continuously insulated? Is the cellar part of it, or isn't it? If it isn't, and of course it's a lot easier to put it outside the envelope. How do you cope with the staircase and the lobby to the staircase down to the cellar? How do you deal with, does this become an external door up here? The stud work underneath the inevitable stairs that go up above it to the first floor, is that insulated? All questions to be answered. We're moving on probably into the 1920s, and we see things, of course, nothing straightforward because a lot of them are altered. But look at this roof here. They've almost made it flat, but they've still got slates on it. Again, if I see this, trouble potentially in the future as materials break down. But also notice how the lintels start to get wider as we get different materials, reinforced concrete lintels, steel lintels, and so forth. So we're going away from the narrow in width type windows, architectural features, letting light in, and all the rest of it. So here we are over the other side, as we call it, which is Lancashire, Chorley, I think. But again, nothing simple. They've had an extension built on. This house has actually been now successfully certified as NFIT, actually. They've spent many years planning it. But basically, again, we've got, of course, wider windows. That would have been plastic replacement at some point. Slate roofs. There'll be an internal valley in there that might be a problem, but not that easy. But in the end, they actually did external wall insulation on this job, and a very nice job they've made of it, I might add. Again, moving on, social housing. This is probably 1940s or 50s after the Second World War. And look, they've had an extension built on later, but we were called in to give them energy advice because they were finding, I think their house went from this point to there actually, that their heating bills were so high. There's been a lot of money spent on this house already. And so you're strapped in a way because of the value of the building after you do work to it. But this is a cold roof, as we call it. Plastic windows, probably double glazed. And again, I picked out the ones that were unusual. This one was built by the Leeds city architect in the 1960s, the head of architecture in Leeds City Council in the days when they were respected. This is basically a stone plinth, if you like, with rooms in it, but the main living area is up here. It is beautiful, but of course these are all single glazed, probably 8 or 10 mil glass. Timber frame, with very little insulation, if any at all, and pretty uncomfortable. This one turned out to be externally, have external wall insulation, and wood fibre, natural material, vapor oven material was used on it, just to maintain its integrity in terms of risk and moisture, but also its look. So it was, I think, replaced. This slating cladding was put back on. We replaced all the glazing with triple glazed units, very similar sizes to this, and a very successful project, actually. Moving on then, and some might say our quality is getting worse. This is a 1970s detached 4-bedroom house over in Greenfield, over the other side of Saddleworth. And this is the standard 12-inch 300mm cavity wall construction with 100 mil of bricks, buff bricks, a 2-inch nominal cavity, and then 50 mil, sorry, and then 100 mil block work inside. Notice I'm talking about walls mainly, but if you look at this, we're actually working on this house and doing quite a radical retrofit on it, which I'll talk about at a later date, actually. But it's had spray foam pumped in from the outside as cavity wall insulation. Now, no bricklayer is ever going to be able to keep these 50 mil cavities clean of mortar. And you'll see some mortar there, and there's some in here, but look at these gaps. Now, this is quite a big problem. Now, the original architect on this job wanted to put on external wall insulation, which in fact wouldn't have been complete. It didn't go join up with the insulation in the over the eaves and into the roof insulation, and it stopped at DPC. So we had bad thermal bridges around the detail they were drawing, but also we've also got air movement in here, continuous air movement, and so heat is in effect drawn out of the building through the brick blockwork, which is porous. Wet plaster is pretty good, actually, but too many gaps and so forth. So the actual external wall insulation, I would question how effective that is because of this thermal bypass. So we, in effect, what we've done is gone for internal wall insulation, so we can actually make it continuous throughout the whole building internally. Accepted this and left it inside, and then we're going to be just doing a decorative render outside. And moving on again, now this is probably what we're building now to pretty well modern regs. So this will be, in our case, stonework, although I think this is reconstituted stone to make it look like stone, so it's treated like bricks. Probably with 100 mil cavity and 50 mil of polyurethane Kingspan what's it called, extra therm inside the cavity. Again, we still have that thermal bypass issue, even if we've got solid bats in here, because we don't adhere them to the blockwork, so we've always got this movement behind. Sorry. Plastic windows, quite cheap. Plastic guttering, good ventilation, look, in the soffit here. Probably no real problems with this house apart from, oh, by the way, this has got dot and dab plasterboard inside, not wet full plaster. So you do get, so these houses tend to be colder, even though it's got that insulation in the cavity, than a house which is more airtight with wet plaster inside and no insulation in the cavity whatsoever, as much as anything because of air movement. We're finding that often. Hello.
Can I hop in? It's Tina. Can I hop in and say, do they also get hotter in very hot weather in summer because of the dot and dab plasterboard, sort of removing any access to any thermal mass?
I'm not aware of it, Tina. I don't think it's the cold and air movement. It's the, we're not here today to talk about that in great detail, but air movement around people makes them uncomfortable. We basically, particularly in intermediate floors, where you've just got the usually timber joist just going into the block work, and then you've got the dot and dab plasterboard on top. You've just got a lot of drafts basically. So these buildings are can be far more drafted than the Victorian house, and that's why we've got our performance gap in this country. They do not perform to what SAP, which is the standard assessment procedure that we use in building, tells us that this building is going to need in terms of energy, quite often 2 to 3 times as much. Now this one is great, it is the same, but I mean, it's not just cheaper houses like that one next door. This is a really expensive 5-bedroom job. And they called me in, they're not on mains gas here, they're right out in the countryside, and they're on LPG, bottled gas, big tank in the garden. But even with central heating fully on, they were still cold, uncomfortable, drafty. Again, this, even though at this quality, built with dot and dab plasterboard, block work, and a rigid insulation with a ventilated cavity. What he wanted, he'd researched quite far, this owner, and what we priced up was taking down the whole of the outer leaf in sections, I might add, filling the, rendering the block work from the outside, the inner leaf that is, filling it with a full fill mineral wool cavity insulation, and then rebuilding the outer leaf. Now, needless to say, it was so expensive that I think he probably moved, because I didn't hear much more about it. And just very quickly, this is part of a Kirklees low energy housing project built in the early 2000s, I think late 1990s, where our sustainable knowledge at that time, before Passive House came along, I would suggest, so we've got actually what they called solar spaces here. So these are social houses, not very big. And so this was deemed as being able to collect sunlight, heat from the sun, and so benefiting the rest of the house. Well, the trouble is that the sun's not out all the time, particularly at night, particularly in winter when we need to heat the houses properly. But look, they're all lived in. We've got net curtains on this one here, and we've got nice flower pot. Basically, people were using them as living rooms, and in my point of view, complete failure. Of course, buildings don't stay in one state. Extensions. So here we are, another extension, and here we are with a modern extension, which we actually did to almost Passive House levels here. So each part of the house has to be looked at in separate ways. It's a pity that the architect didn't have an extension covering the end wall or wrapped round maybe, because that's actually quite a good way of improving the performance of an envelope. And of course, what's the general state of the building? Now, when I see this, I think, yippee. We could do anything with that one. But of course, most houses have had a lot of value put into them one way or another. Even this small terrace house, this person was really put a lot of thought into their tiny kitchen, tiny relatively kitchen, but they were cold. What do? Rip it out, start again. There's a lot of value there. And this is the sort of thing we have to deal with all the time. So what problems do we get, particularly with walls? Well, obviously we know this one. This is rising damp. How do we deal with that? Pardon me. Maybe there's tanking. This is modern tanking, obviously the egg bot plastic type. that was failing. So what we're below ground here. A lot of buildings in West Yorkshire are like that because it's so hilly around here. How do we deal with that? Here we are. Do you remember that nice weaver's cottage I showed you earlier? Well, what we have been doing since the 1970s, because it was nice and twee, we've been taking off the nice or the very nicely installed timber linings around these windows, which at least covered up this massive cold bridge. So what we quite often have done over the many years we work around here is put in a very good performing window, particularly if it's a triple glazed window now. And what happens is we just get absolute black mold around here because this is just throwing heat out of the building through this stonework. A big problem, but quite often people accept it because it looks pretty, which, well, anyway, that's a debatable subject. Rendering of all sorts. This is quite a good performing in terms of staying there render, and it probably works, pardon me, because we're very high up in the Pennines, rainfall is heavy, we're very exposed, and quite often the original stone gable ends were built of inferior stonework. Now, there's a lot of debate about renders, whether they should be totally lime and sand, or a mixture of lime, sand and cement. It's debatable. We've tried to use lime and sand, and unfortunately it's failed a few times because it's been too soft and it's been washed off. We need educating a bit, so we revert back to a mixture of lime, cement and sand. Floors. Now, big one. I think we're going to talk about this a bit more. This one actually is in a more a Georgian house, really, or early Victorian house. Notice that they haven't built the joists into the walls, which is quite interesting. They've actually got cross members on top of sleeper walls. It did have ventilation underneath and was in surprisingly good condition. The client didn't want us to put it in a solid floor, which was a pity because they wanted the original floorboard sanding and going back. So what we did was put a vapor open wind tightness membrane over the up and over the joists and filled with mineral wool insulation in between. Crawl spaces, sometimes you can get underneath and can work underneath, but to be quite honest, this is what you usually find. It's not straightforward, unfortunately. Around here we have flags, stone flags, and this particular house had them on buried timber grounds in basically earth and stone. Amazingly, that there wasn't dry rot in this house. They've been there what, 150 years. It must be a comment on the quality of the timber, actually. Ventilation. You've all seen these. This should have what's called a cavity sleeve, where usually clay, pardon me, which then takes the ventilation beyond the cavity into underneath the floor void. A lot of modern housing have this block and beam, but again, you still need ventilation underneath to stop gases building up. I treat these as if this was the ground level and starting again with air tightness and insulation on top. So roofs, different types of roofs. This one is king posts, I think, or queen posts. I'm not sure which way around it is, but this was common in the earlier housing in this area. I don't know how much it is in other areas of the country. So basically the main structure is held on these trusses here. Secondary support is then these purlins running horizontally. Then we have the rafters, the normal rafters. These are usually 75 by 75 millimeters, 3x3. This one has been recovered underneath with then battens running horizontally for the tiles or slates to hang off. This is a simpler design, which most houses will have at that period, where particularly smaller houses where you've got purlins. This is an older house where it's actually, you see this quite often actually, with actual tree, well, trunks actually. They haven't even bothered to square them up. This one was unusual. Look, it's actually got sarking board timber underneath. This is what they do in Scotland a lot, of course. And these are the rafters. So these purlins stretch from masonry wall to masonry wall without those trusses shown earlier. I couldn't find any good photos of modern trusses. This is a very cheap way of building. That's why most modern developments have this, unless they have a room in the roof, but even then they have a version of it. These are very cheap. I think, you know, these can be 30, 40, 50 quid each, lifted up by two people up the scaffold and plonked on, and these roofs can be on in half a day or a day, ready for covering. That's why they're so popular now, but of course it takes away a lot of the space in the for future work as an attic room. Chimneys, always a big problem, particularly for us around here. This is lead work. This is replacement lead work, you can see, as we've done here on a job over in Lancashire with brickwork. But look at this pointing here. There'll be no damp-proof course in this age of chimney. So you will, even though the lead work is working well, it might well be that water's going to get in here and run down behind the lead and then start percolating into the building below. Always a big problem, chimneys. If you're doing a radical retrofit, maybe take them out. So this is an apron, and the soakers, if you heard about soakers, are there, which actually sit underneath the different layers, courses of slate in this situation, and then the flashing sits over it. So a lot of area for going wrong actually in the future. Valleys, of course, you know all about that probably. Lead work has to be laid in no more than 2 meter lengths, ideally 1.5 meters, because of expansion and contraction and splitting. So we're moving inside. Now look at this. This is coal bridging. So quite often this is a social housing. In fact, that low energy project I showed you earlier. This is because of well, several reasons. Lack of ventilation, probably because people can't afford to heat the housing, and coal bridging. So there'll be a timber here going from our plasterboard right out to the slates or tiles, which makes this area colder. That's why we've got condensation, and look at it around the edges of the velux, where obviously this hasn't been dealt with in the reveals. Very common sight. When you go up in the roof, this is looking up at the ridge. This is the material that we all used up to a few years ago under Slater's membrane, which is actually non-porous. That's why we need ventilation. That is actually cut and a ridge ventilator on top. We need vents at the eaves for a constant airflow. Modern materials, which are now like Gore-Tex, vapor open, we don't need this ventilation quite as much, although building control will still argue you do. Moving on, attic hatches. how well are they fitted? As you can see, that one's okay. At least it stops most of the draft, but you need it to be a bit more sophisticated nowadays. Rooms in, storage space in the roof, quite common, very useful. But if you might only have 75 mil or 100 mil of insulation under here, how do you deal with that if you're going to be upping your insulation in this cold roof to 150, 300 mil, ideally at least 300? So a lot of people actually start putting another floor in at this level, so we've got continuity of insulation across. Dormers, or very exposed for obvious reasons, very thin cheeks and sides. How do we insulate them? They're very vulnerable both to heat loss and maintenance. Intermediate floors. Our plaster usually stops here, 3 inches from the floor, and we've usually just got rubble inside. That will be plaster and last ceiling to the ground floor below. This area inside our intermediate floor is a big problem area for air ingress and drafts. This is what we tend to do if we can. I mean, this is radical because we've lost the ceiling underneath. But if we can render or parge between the wet plaster on the ground floor and the first floor, we cut out, I would suggest, most of the drafts in the house. Of course, when a plumber and electrician gets in this area underneath the floor, when they're putting in a new bathroom, they'll never be thinking about this. Right, windows. Obviously, this is one of the easiest things to replace. Do you do double or triple? We would suggest triple, because in our situation, it becomes a value judgment. But if we're looking at U values, building regs is 1.4 now for replacement U value. And if you can get down to 0.9 with triple, for not much extra cost, one might argue that you might as well put in triple. Here's a later, probably 1920s casement window. This was actually down in Oxford. But look how different areas do things differently. It's quite interesting. They've got an external architrave here, which to us here in West Yorkshire, that would rot within 2 days. But this has lasted since the 1920s. Really quite extraordinary. It might be said that all timber of the past tended to be tighter grain and longer lasting. But of course, most of our buildings seem to be now replaced with double glazed plastic windows, as we have here with the 1970s house. So the original timber would have been taken out and plastic put in. Lintels. Stone lintels, talked about the width being narrows because basically they crack. Here we're not having reinforcing in that we often have to replace. This is a soldier arch over in Manchester. As soon as the building starts moving slightly and the mortar starts disintegrating a bit or drying out or whatever, we tend to get this. And what happens was that the window actually holds up this brickwork. So if you're into replacing windows, this is obviously got to be dealt with one way or the other. This is, I couldn't find a picture of a Capnick, and this is a modern version actually. So it holds up both of the leaves, inner and outer, with a damp-proof cavity course here. Can you see that? The earlier ones, the majority of housing in 80s, 70s, 60s won't have that insulation in. So it's actually quite a cold bridge. It's just steel going all the way through. A lot of our buildings around here anyway often have an internal timber lintel. They might have a stone external or soldier arch like this one, brickwork, but inside that can be quite often rotten at the ends. just to be aware of them. Sash windows are built into check, as we call it, where the weights were for counterbalancing the sashes, the sash casement. So big lead weights would be housed in this area. This actually works in our favour if we're doing internal wall insulation, because we can bring the same strategy around and into the window. So we've got that continuity. That's quite useful. And of course, what happens when we've got beautiful bits of architecture? We know that the air movement behind here is atrocious. If we were doing internal wall insulation, what happens with this quite often ornate and beautiful coving? It is a problem. Sometimes we've actually insulated to here and then put like a wooden shelf on top to maintain it, maintain the effect. Very difficult to make this detail airtight even if you're just replacing the window here for obvious reasons. Debatable. Right, this is the end of that talk really. Apart from when I go into a house, I will be coming from a passive house aspect, or put it another way, a fabric first philosophy. So I will be thinking about how can we make insulation continuous. Ideally, we would be making it, particularly with internal wall insulation, a total U value of 0.35, which is around modern building regs. So that is the equivalent of, say, 100 mil of wood fibre or 50 mil of polyurethane. But that will all be dealt with later by Andy in Module 5. I've been trying to minimise the thermal bridging, which is commensurate with the continuity of insulation. I'll be looking at trying to have a strategy of air tightness. Easier said than done in retrofitting existing buildings, but you've still got it in your mind when you're looking at that first visit. Ventilation, well, obviously MVHR in passive houses, but what are we going to have? Mechanical extracts in kitchens and bathrooms and trickle vents over other windows? Are we going to have a centralized MEV, a sort of a continuously running central ventilation unit that sort of speeds up when we've got high humidity or CO2, for example? And also overheating might be an issue, but I suggest a bit less than with new build. Anyway, Tina, that's the end of that. I'll shut up. And
thank you very much, Bill.
Talk to me now.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Bill. Well, what I'm going to suggest is that we take our first question. Well, first of all, I suppose, has anyone got any burning questions about the presentation itself? Anything, particularly if you didn't understand anything or anything wasn't clear, then perhaps put up your hand and we'll deal with anything sort of immediate before we move on to the questions proper. So I'll give you a couple of moments to think about that. But then I think what I'd like to do is to bring up the questions that various people have sent in. And some of these questions are good generic questions. So would you like me to put them up on my screen, Bill?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay, in that case, give me a moment and I will just put in, takes a few seconds to do this, make myself the presenter.
Yeah, I can see that.
I've just put, hopefully you can all see that. If you can't, send me a message, let me know. But I'll start with the first question that I was sent, which is from Ben. And he asked, thinking of a traditional build house and suspended floors, so if we could go through the different options for dealing with rotten joists and how you choose which pre-retrofit remedial option is best. So obviously sorting out the problem before you, or deciding how to sort out the problem before you embark on the retrofit, very importantly. And you'd just like a bit more extra detail on the main options there.
Okay, right. Hi, Ben. It depends what age of house it is, I would suggest. Is there a damp-proof course or not? I'm assuming not if there's rotting. Usually, if you've got a DPC, you won't have that rising damp problem. So if they're rotted with no damp-proof course, the traditional way of dealing with it can be to chop the acro it up or prop the floor up, to chop the joist off, and to either put a horizontal wall plate running against the wall, if you like, with a damp-proof course behind it, and the joist then hung off that wall plate. Or what I've seen done or done ourselves is that you chop those rotten joists off and you actually plant another timber against it, bolt it through so it becomes structurally integral, and wrap the new bit of timber, new joist, with a damp-proof course, plastic damp-proof course, and build it into a new opening in the wall. Both is quite extensive work, to be quite honest, one way or the other, but you haven't got much choice. I'm wondering if that answers your question, Ben. Is he with us today, Tina?
Unmute him. I think Ben may be one of the people who can't. Ben, can you hear us?
Yes, that's very sorry. That's very helpful. Thank you. I suppose that the other thing I would say is, what presumably, if the deterioration is so great, there must be come a point where maybe the whole flooring needs to be replaced, or is it normally possible just to go with one of the first two options that you mentioned?
Well, quite often it depends. Well, how much money the client has, and how deep the. I mean, is it? Have you got a cellar underneath, or a crawl space, or has everything got to be exposed from above? I suppose that's the question, really. I mean, the real can't put it. The answer that would do away with all problems is take out all the timber and put in a solid floor with a lot of insulation. You then have no rotting or ventilation issues. You have a continuity of insulation and very airtight. But that's quite radical.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
On Bill, while I've got a couple of people who perhaps sent a few questions in just relating to that. So I suppose, what if you find, Adam James has asked, how would you approach if you find dry or wet rot in your masonry timber in the stone walls? What would you think about there?
There's a difference between wet and dry rot here, quite a big difference actually. Dry rot can live beyond timber. It needs timber to propagate, but actually once it's in your walls, it can lay dormant even if you take away those rotting timbers. Dry rot is quite a specialist thing to deal with. There are fairly benign materials, liquids that you can use nowadays to get rid of it. Wet rot generally will disappear if you take the water away and make it ventilated, or make the area ventilated. So I think you treat those as very different. So wet rot in a masonry wall will be the timber. It's not the actual masonry itself. Does that make sense? Is that Adam who asked that question?
Yes.
Is he around?
I think. Hello, Adam. Can you? I've just unmuted you. I can't remember exactly who couldn't speak. So Adam, can you hear us? Can you speak?
Come in, Adam. No, he's not there.
I think he might be one of the people who hasn't got a microphone. So, but he sent another comment. Which...
So, what approach is this? The question 2 then that we're dealing with now.
He's leading on to the question 2 because he did send in a question at the beginning saying, what approach would you take when you encounter wet rot in an existing stone wall that was previously poorly retrofitted, and about dry lining and cement masonry render externally?
Okay. Oh, I see. Right. Well, if there is wet rot, it will be because the dry lining has timber in it, I assume, and that'll be the issue. So I would suspect one would have to take all that dry lining off and use some other internal wall insulation methodology, such as a vapor open system. Most people nowadays would be using wood fiber board. We've taken it further, and you'll see on our website if people want to look at it. We've used that diathanite, the spray-on diathanite, lime and cork, which is completely vapor and capillary open, and also the lime is acidic. Is it acidic? No, it's the other. Alkaline, very alkaline, and so mold growth can't happen or rot. It's a matter of timber and wet with a lack of ventilation that you have wet rot.
Because Adam's note here that he sent to me typed it, so it seems to be pervading through the stone masonry, but you're saying that's it's not really feeding on the stone, it's feeding on things that are on the stone or adjacent to the stone, like any product that it can feed on, really, but not the stone itself. Yeah.
So there might be timber grounds around windows in the brickwork. There may be timber lintels, internal timber lintels, but it'll always, wet rot is to do with timber, as is dry rot, but dry rot is a lot more dangerous, actually. So I would get it checked and make sure it is wet rot and not dry rot, because the tentacles can spread quite far, Doctor Who-like, actually.
Okay. So when you mentioned diathanite and these other alkaline products, that would that work with dry rot as well as wet rot, in that neither can really get a hold once you use that sort of product?
I would treat, if it's dry rot, I would treat the masonry with the one I know from the past was called boracol. I'm sure there's others, which is naturally occurring borates, actually, in glycol, which then actually infiltrate the masonry. It was called boracol 10. I haven't used it for quite a few years, actually. And that tend to be quite successful in stopping, killing it, basically, but in a less, in a more benign way for humans. The diathanite would certainly not allow, or it certainly wouldn't set up a nice environment for any rot, actually. So it answers a lot of questions, lime.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for that. Before we go on to our next questions, I'm just thinking we're coming up to around about 1 o'clock, when we normally have a 10-minute break, just so everyone can have a cup of tea and so on. And then we'll come back after that for the remaining questions that have been sent in. And then there's time, some extra questions, if anyone wants to type them to me through the questions box, or just freely ask them at the end, put up your hand and I'll bring you in. So I think we'll have a 10-minute break now, come back in exactly 10 minutes time, whatever that is on your clock, and we will start again with coming in with a couple of questions that people have sent in relating to their own projects. So bringing in Debbie or an Alistair, and then moving on to some questions that relate to other parts of the module, specifically some of the quizzes. Well, welcome back, everyone. If you're already back in with us, we're just getting up a picture that Bill's going to use to illustrate his answer to a question that Nicholas sent in, and then we'll move on to look at a couple of other real projects where people have got a few questions. I think we'll be looking at Debbie's and then Alistair's. That's for you to talk.
Well, I'll read out Nicholas's questions, which are very poignant, actually, around the debate, really, between the historic building perspective and moisture movement and the and thermal performance, which don't necessarily marry together. So anyway, Nicholas's question to me: Bill, what are your views on the effectiveness of internal tanking to address rising damp in a traditional building, as shown in one of your photographs? Right, that's the first part of his question. This picture that you can see here, I hope, is what was exposed. This is in fact we did a retrofit of a barn conversion, a 1990s barn conversion, pardon me. And this part of the building was below ground, to that level that you can see, or about a 300 mil a foot below it. And what they view, tanking in itself is going to be impervious. It wouldn't work otherwise, I don't believe. So what I think Nicholas is alluding to is that any rising damp in that wall here will be pushed up, if you like, through osmosis, because you're stopping the wall breathing in, if you like, or evaporating in this direction. You're closing off the vapor movement of the original wall. I would suggest that in the original building, this wall would be damp. I don't think, it may well be that there was vapor movement, but it will mean mold growth on it as well. So I don't think there's an actual perfect answer. Now I've been working in this area, although I come from Devon originally, but I mean, I've been in Yorkshire for 40 odd years and I've been building all that time. And we use plastic sheet. Oh, Emma says we can't see any pictures.
Yeah, yes. We've probably run into that problem again where we just need to see your screen. Have you got in the sharing part on the dashboard? Yeah. Have you got the second, four round buttons? The second one from the left, showing your screen. If you click that,
show screen.
There we go. Got it. Thank you. That's great.
All right. Thank you, Emma. Right. Sorry. Right. I hope I don't have to go over that again, but here we have this plastic, modern type, which was done about 30 or 40 years ago, tanking material. When you're underground, and by the way, they've used blue plastic. Can you see that underneath the solid floor? So the question that Nicholas is giving is that the historic England, or whatever else it's called, historic England, historic environment, Scotland, would prefer if we use more vapor open materials in this situation so that the buildings can breathe. What some people say is that if you put an impervious layer over damp masonry in this situation, it pushes moisture further back up the wall, either through osmosis or through vapor movement, actually dragging it out from below. and that you'll get salts coming through the plasterwork in this situation. I must admit, as I said, I've been building around here for many years, and in a very damp part of the world, and we have been doing plastic DP, damp-proof membranes, and plastic tanking occasionally, and I haven't run into that problem. Now, why that is, I don't know. So I'm not aware of a natural way of doing tanking other than to build a separating wall of some sort and having a ventilated cavity behind. I know that with solid floors, the people are, and I haven't done this myself yet, I'd like to, they're using foam glass nodules as a hardcore and to a certain extent a damp-proof course, and it acts as insulating material as well, albeit that lambda value isn't that good. And then hempcrete type materials instead of concrete on the floors. I haven't gone in that direction, Les, but I know quite a lot of people are looking at it, and hopefully as it becomes cheaper and more common, it will become more relevant. I can understand the theory behind it, but I haven't used it so far. So the second part of Nicholas's question, Tina, was further question on floor replacement. Bill, what are your views on the risk of moisture moving to wall footings following replacement of suspended floor? Well, that's what I've been talking about now. I've actually tried to answer both parts of his question.
Bill, Andy Love has got his hand up, so I'm just wondering if this is relating to the same question. Andy, I'm just going to bring you in, because if your question is related, we might as well bring you in now. So, hello, Andy.
Yeah. Andy, hello?
Hello?
No.
No. Okay, not to worry. In that case, was that the whole of Nicholas's question?
He's probably going to throw abuse at me, so that's all right.
It's okay. Oh, Andy sent me a message. Okay, that's fine. No. So what we could do is see if Debbie is around, and then we can put up her. She sent in a question about a particular project. Now I know, Bill, you have a chance to look at this, but I'll just bring Debbie in and see if she's got any particular question that she would like to ask. Hi there, Debbie. Can you hear us? Hello there. Just bringing your project up now. Would you like to? Are there any particular questions you'd like to ask Bill that sort of relate?
Well, it's actually very much the same issue. I don't know if you've got the drawing there at all.
Yes, I have. I'll just try and get it up for you. Just a moment.
Okay, thank you. Because I did just send you another one. I know it's really late, but it just showed also some photos of.
Okay, well, I'll go and look at those. For the moment, can you now see my screen?
Yeah, it's there. Okay. So, hi, Bill.
Hi.
I really have got the same kind of issue here without the kind of retrofitting taking place yet. So if you can see number 2 on the detail, so that's basically the existing, and in between the two internal layers of blocks, they've got one of the some of that RIW tanking, and that whole area is really wet, and so my client's pushing me to act really quickly on this, and I've had to explain to them that it's not something that I want to rush, because my immediate thing is, well, let's put some of that Newton membrane and or similar product and put a drain in there and insulate. But you're showing me that photo and how that is a potential risk as well. So I'm glad that I'm hesitating on coming forward with that solution, but I just don't know what your thoughts are on it.
Well, what I'm trying to say is there's no easy answer.
I know. I got that. That's why I joined the course, I think.
And what I said, we have used plastic in those damp situations,
It's been okay.
and it's been okay. But you just have to be. So, for example, in the past, we've put on top of that plastic, we've actually put timber grounds, because they sell plugs with that system, which you can screw into. Which you put butyl tape around the plugs, so you keep the tanking integral. And what we've done in the past is use actually treated timbers, whether that's treated with borates or not, as and then insulation, usually mineral wool between, and sometimes PU, and then a vapor control layer over the top of that. Nowadays we have the intelligent membranes, such as the Proclimer Intello, which allows someone to come back out the other way. So are you talking about insulating as well, or just the...
Well, this is what I was going to say, is because of the staircase is existing and it's in a fairly reasonable condition. It must be quite new, but it's butted right up against that, and she doesn't really want to move the floor and the staircase or anything. So that's, I'm quite limited with space as well. But I was thinking of maybe treating
below ground. So the bottom of the staircase is below ground, is it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you can see across the section there's like a dotted line of where the ground level is.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yes.
So it's all pretty much subterranean.
What we've done in the past is maybe even if there's a lot of water, groundwater, we've put a land drain in. Rather than one of the sump systems that people like Triton will try and sell you, and then dress the underfloor damp-proof membrane up in front of the plastic egg box tanking stuff, and so that any water that does run down behind it runs down below the damp-proof membrane, and hopefully is dissipated by a land drain underneath, or a soak away even. And you maybe could form enough of a void behind the string of that skirting to get that plastic egg box stuff behind it.
Yeah. Okay, well that's really useful, because that's what I had in mind. So it's, you know, it helps me to...
Just as an interesting point on that particular job that I showed you just now, we replaced, we used that's a rubble filled ex-barn wall, 450 mil thick, stone and stone with rubble in between, and what we used was a vapor and capillary open perlite, almost like shortbread actually, from Germany. It's not available here easily. But what I did on the tanking was to use foam glass. Do you know?
Okay. And I've really seen it in the detail at the bottom of the junction between the foundation walls and the, you know, cavity wall. Is that what you mean? That kind of insulated block? Oh,
where's that? Under insulated, but no, that tends to be things like silicon, you know, a better performing concrete block as such. Foam glass is an expensive but very absolutely impervious, but it's an insulator as well. I think it has a lambda value that's not bad, probably 0.06 or 0.05 or something like that. But you can use it as tanking. So what we did, used 2 inches or 50 mil of the foam glass slabs up to 600 mil, and then brought the 100 mil of the Tec-Tem, the perlite system, down to it, and revert to a 2-inch bit of Tec-Tem in front of the foam glass. So we had the integrity of insulation, the U value continuous all the way up the wall, including down in front of the tanking, but stopping any excess groundwater getting into the building, and that was very successful, although not cheap. And
this is always the difficulty of that.
With the staircase there, for example.
Yeah, the staircase is one of the issues, really. You know, I keep thinking maybe she just needs to take it out, but then she really doesn't want to, so I don't know.
You could put a ladder in its place, couldn't you, and tell her to. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll be facetious.
That's great. Thanks, Bill.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, now I'll go on and bring up Alistair's project. Alistair, I'm just trying to bring you in now. So, hello, Alistair. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hi there. Right,
Hi.
let me just try and bring up your project. And you had a couple of questions relating to it. So let's see if I can get it. Here we go. Okay, so you had done a nice diagram there of your building and got quite a few questions. Don't know, is there something you'd like to pick out, Alistair, where you'd particularly like to ask Bill?
I guess first of all, there was I do have one question, and it relates to repairing joist ends. And could you just kind of clarify how the construction process is or relates to the cement parge coat? Because it's never something that I've really heard of before.
Yeah. Right. It depends on the actual risk. It's always down to risk. So you'll find out more in module 5 with Andy, but we have 3 or 4 main risks, moisture risks in solid walls or masonry walls. Rising damp, which can in modern buildings shouldn't happen. We've got rain-driven damp, which is more solid walls are more susceptible to that than cavity walls, hopefully. We've got interstitial condensation, which is the where the internal moist air has reached its dew point. In other words, it starts condensing as it goes through the wall where the joist ends are. So one has to think about all 3 of those moisture risks when looking at joist ends. So that rendering between the joists that you saw that we would like to do is before we take insulation, internal wall insulation, continuously up through that floor void so that we've got that continuity. Now, what you saw on that one was a cavity wall. It was a modern cavity wall. So we deemed that that was less of a risk. So could I ask, in your building that you're asking about, what is it, a solid wall or is it a more modern cavity?
No, that question was really kind of a side step to the
Okay.
to the demonstration. It's just something that part.
What we did after that picture that you saw, that photograph of us, and by the way, parging is you use very weak sand cement, 8:1, something like that, so it doesn't crack. We would then tape that at least around those joists to stop or try and stop air movement in the gaps that open up with the timber shrinking slightly against the mortar. So what we did on that particular job, because the risk was relatively low of rain penetration because it was a cavity wall, we took up a system of mineral wool with extruded polystyrene studs with OSB stuck on them, and then an intelligent vapor barrier over the top of it. And then that vapor barrier was taped to all 4 sides of the joist. So it's quite extensive work on that particular project.
Okay.
Yeah, Carry on.
Yeah, one other question, and it's I think you kind of touched on it in the first half of your presentation, where you mentioned that a continuous air tightness, when dealing with a retrofit.
Yes.
Because this building is in a conservation area, it's I'm not really I don't think it's going to be possible to do an external insulation. So, as a rule of thumb, rather than having one side externally insulated and the other internally, would it be better practice to have everything as internally insulated?
I don't know. So is it a detached house or a terrace or a semi?
Yeah, terrace.
Terrace. Well, there's been quite a few in London done this way. Well, a few, where they've actually done external wall insulation on the rear elevations, and internal on the front of the house, if you like, because of course with a terrace external wall insulation, you have, where do you stop? Well, you have to stop at the end of your house, but you then have quite a thermal bridge through the partition wall. At least with internal wall insulation, you could return it to some extent and cut down that thermal bridge. External wall insulation is less risky in terms of moisture, in terms of interstitial condensation, because you're actually warming the masonry up.
Yeah.
With internal wall insulation, it's the opposite. You're making things more risky because you're making the masonry external wall colder, and particularly if you've got joist ends in it. So one has to be careful and know what one's doing. In reality, and you can't put this in building regs, there is a very different risk in depending on lifestyle, actually. If you've got, dare I say, a middle-class family, two professionals that are out working all day with central heating coming on and heating the house up, interstitial condensation usually isn't an issue, even if it's built badly. Okay. If you've got a smaller dwelling without central heating in and people living there all day, not being able to afford to heat it, interstitial condensation becomes a greater risk. But one can't regulate about that, so one has to talk about the worst situation. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Well, I got the chance. Thanks, Bill.
That's okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Alistair. Now, I think we've got a couple more questions have come in. So, Bill, I'm just going to start with, and just bring it up again. Now, what have we got? Quite a few here. Well, I've got a few questions that actually that was sent in by Maria, and then I'll move on to the questions that have just been sent in. So we're doing them in order. Okay. Maria had a number of questions, which I've put up on the screen, number 5 on your sheet there, Bill. And some of those are really, possibly all of them are moving into module 5 territory, where we talk about the actual measures used and the moisture and all the full implications. But I mean, I just wondered if you wanted to pick out one of Maria's questions that will be worth talking about now before we move on to the others.
Well, let's look at quiz question 8. Is that module 5 quiz or module 3?
I think it's module 3, but I think what Maria's... Okay. Oh, okay. Actually, let's see if I can bring Maria in just to double check. Because if it is module 5, we'll leave it to module 5. But hi, Maria, are you able to join us? I'll just check whether Maria is one of the people who hasn't got a microphone. No, she hasn't got a microphone, so I'm not sure, unless she can quickly type.
Let me just read that. If there was an option to choose within a rafter insulation refurbishment warm roof and repairing the existing ceiling cold roof, what strategy could be the safest and less risky of thermal bridging being created? Right. There is there's a difference between a warm roof and a cathedral roof, and we get them mixed up. I do myself, actually. Cathedral roof, it tends to be where you've got the insulation within the roof pitch, and a warm roof should be where you actually have the insulation on top of your structure, where which is actually the least risky way of doing that that detail, but that's obviously not practical in a lot of cases. To actually, in an existing building, to change from a cold roof situation where you've got the insulation on top of your first floor flat ceiling, to putting it in between the rafters is, I would suggest, quite an expensive way of doing it. I would suggest, if you were, different scenarios warrant different methodologies. Pretty obvious, isn't it? If you were converting the attic space, you obviously would be going into a cathedral or warm roof situation, and you would deal with it as such. If you were just leaving it as a flat ceiling without using that space up above, I would tend to work with improving the insulation or keeping it as a cold roof. If you were keeping it as a cold roof or a pitched roof, not putting a room up there, and you could recover the roof using very good vapor open wind tightness underslaters membrane, that would be great, because you don't need the through ventilation that the old fashioned bitumen type underslaters membrane we had to use in the past. In other words, we could take the insulation, usually mineral wool, very cheap, or warm cell blown in there, or polystyrene beads, and take it right into the eaves, where for obvious reasons it gives better continuity of insulation, particularly if you've got internal wall insulation strategy. I'm wondering if that answers that question. Do you think it does, Tina, or not?
I think, well, perhaps if Debbie is able to type a little answer, whether she feels that's answered her question. Perhaps that gives the ultimate answer. I think that was helpful from my point of view. But
okay. Well, if other people could type in or whatever their question, if it didn't make sense, that would be great to be told. Right. In this specific homework roof scenario, would you put the airtight layer at the ceiling level? I'm just reading that one, or at rafter level, since the cold roof would need to be ventilated. Right. The vapor control layer definitely goes underneath your flat ceiling, if you like. The reason being that you always have your vapor control layer, airtightness layer, on the warm side of insulation. This is to stop infiltration, obviously, of warm, moist air getting into a colder space above. So what we've done in the past in existing buildings is to leave the existing ceiling in place, particularly if it's plaster and lath, as it's so filthy, to actually put a vapor control layer over the top of it, and hopefully you might be able to get it over the top of internal partitions, but if not, taped in, and then maybe even a service void, timber battens, inch timber battens screwed up through the vapor barrier and the existing ceiling into the ceiling joists above for wiring and lighting, and then plasterboard and skim below. I'm hoping that, right, so would the airtight layer being unnecessary at rafters, uncontrolled ventilation, or is it generally a controlled ventilation device through vents? I'm not quite sure I understand that one. I'm going to move on to question 10. In the scenario, you have to preserve the floor tiles due to historic heritage reasons or similar. What would be the best way to approach the floor retrofit? Would it be possible to access the shallow void from the sidewall, leaving the floorboards and tiles on top? crikey. It's quite an extreme scenario. However, I would like to know if there's a way to still insulate and make the floor airtight. Well, there are materials, if it can be exposed, isonine, which is the blown foam material. Isonine, I know, is vapor open. So if it can be, if you can get in there with nozzles, that might be a way of dealing with it. I'm always careful though when doing insulating between existing timber floor joists. Do you stop ventilation around those floor joists if you insulate between, so upping the risk of the joist ends rotting in the future? Just a question to ask, really.
I mean, Bill, someone's mentioned these Q-bots, but I think they're still, I don't know what stage they've got to with testing that out and so on.
Well, I know that Andy's been involved with that, hasn't he? So, and that would be using that type of material I've just talked about.
Yeah.
I'm, from a sustainable construction point of view, we wonder, we've looked into it actually, and we don't, because they keep secret what the ingredients are of these materials, and that the applicator has to dress in as if they're in a nuclear fallout zone. One wonders how safe those materials are. We're told that it's about them curing, or the dangerous time, or potentially dangerous, is around when they're curing and when they're applying, and don't off-gas later. But I've got to leave that for other people to question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Right. What sort of hydroscope material can be generally used to stop thermal bridging from intermediate floor junctions? What is the standard distance from external wall they would need to cover? I wondered if I could go back to, could I go to another PowerPoint?
Yes, certainly. I'll make you presenter again.
Yeah. I think. Okay.
You may need to go back to the sharing screen and press that second round.
Am I there now? Do you see me?
Yes, I've got your computer screen now, so we just need the image. Mm-hmm.
Okay. This was a talk that I gave in Swindon Self-Build Centre maybe a year and a half ago, so it's not complete. So I'm going to very quickly go to that detail of what we used, or how we just get that out of the way. Right. Very quickly, we tend to use materials in a pragmatic way. So this is, yeah. Can you see that or not?
On the screen yet?
I'll go back.
I've got your computer screen up, but I haven't got any files. That's it. Yep. Now I'm looking at it.
You are now or not?
Well, I'm now looking at your Explorer. So I can see your folders and your files.
You can, right. So if I go to this PowerPoint here.
Yes, it's coming up. Yep.
You can see. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to find that junction here. So as you can see, what we've done is taken, in this situation where we've got cavity wall here, we've taken the insulation strategy right the way through the floor and taped to the vapor control layer, the VCL, and then to have a service void on top here. But what we've done, I'm just going to move on here. Right, this was the next job we went on to, Radical Retrofit at Meltham, and we've separated the floor joist from the external wall by putting in a wall plate, held off the wall with what's called compact foam, which is a heat-altered polystyrene. It's not that cheap, but used in small amounts like this, it's very useful in that that's got a lambda value similar to ordinary polystyrene. And then what we've done is taken the insulation through it. We've actually sort of hand packed it in there before spraying it on later. So there's a gap in there as well. Does that, and then we've bolted through that into with, I don't know what sort of anchor bolts they are, to hold this actually floor up. This is to get continuity of insulation through the intermediate floor. It is to make the air tightness continuous, and to take away the risk of rotting timber in the external wall. Quite radical though, and I would suggest one needs a building of low value rather than ripping out expensive ceilings and floors to do it. Does that make any sense? Do you think that was an answer to that question, Tina?
I think so, yes. I think the pictures always help. So yes, I think so.
Okay. Right.
Okay, so if we move
on to now.
Well, I've got a couple more questions that have come in.
I'll try and answer them.
Yes. So what I'll do is I'll show my screen again so that people can see the questions themselves. Yeah. So, okay. Have you got that now? First one is Jacob Kelly's question. So it's about the roof space and a slate roof with no membrane, a few missing ridge tiles, but otherwise quite good condition. So there's 20 to 50% moisture in the timber, but not rotting yet.
Yeah.
Building unused and unheated for 5 years. So the question is, would you just look to repair the ridge and put in a membrane and insulation below, or would it be better to re-roof it from the outside, perhaps?
So do we think there's a room in the roof or not? Is it a cold room?
Jacob in. Let me just have a quick look. Jacob, I can't remember if you're one of the people who has got a microphone, so I'll just try and bring you in. If you have got a mic, Jacob, then say hello and we'll bring you into the question to talk about it. Hi there.
Yeah. Hi, Jacob.
Hi. Yeah, it's we're looking to sort of change it to a cathedral type roof.
Right. Okay.
Underneath.
Right. I would suggest then that if you've got a chance of recovering it, it makes life easier. It's going to have to be done at some time in its life, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But if people can't afford it, so be it. One would, if you haven't got a membrane underneath, you're going to be in danger of rain-driven moisture blowing up under the tiles or snow. So I would suggest that one would have to leave probably a 50 mil air gap above insulation. But having said that, if you haven't got much headroom within that attic room that you're creating, one would tend to go to a higher performing material such as polyurethane, Kingspan or Celotex, of course. But there are downsides to that. One, it's not vapor open. So if you've got moisture being blown in there and you haven't renewed the roof covering outside, it would be advisable that that's able to evaporate away. And the Celotex will obviously, or Kingspan, is vapor closed. Also, rigid insulation between timbers has to be done very carefully, and for any air gaps around the edges to be foamed, really, with construction foam, because if you've got air movement around that insulation, that rigid insulation, as the timber moves with because of thermal, heat, summer and winter and so forth, that air movement diminishes the performance of that insulation quite markedly around the edges. And so soft materials between timber tend to work better, even though the lambda value isn't as good. For example, I would tend towards using a better mineral wool. You can get them with U values down to 0.032 now. Now remember that Kingspan, something like that, is 0.22, and ordinary fiberglass 0.40 or 0.45. So the more expensive 0.32 is quite a nice compromise. And somewhat at times what we've done is actually use mineral wool between the timber, and then we've used a rigid board backed polyurethane to shoot over the whole of the underneath of the rafters, if you like. So that you've gained you've been pragmatic and used the benefit of both types. If you were to renew the covering, and you could use, as I said, one of the more better performing wind tight vapor open type membranes, where you could take the insulation right up to the bottom. You don't need an insulation ventilation gap there. Quality control might argue a bit with you, but I would suggest that that's the case. That's how we build nowadays. But we have to use counter battens on top of that, running on top of the rafters, because obviously you don't have the natural droop of the membrane underneath for rain to run down behind the horizontal slated battens. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that does. Thanks. Yeah.
But of course, that then sorts it all out. But you've obviously had to spend a lot of money.
Yeah, I think cost is the issue at the moment with fully replacing.
What you could do is partly, couldn't you? You could leave an insulation gap, put some insulation. What depth are your rafters? How deep?
Pretty deep. I've got a figure in front of me, but yeah, we've actually got quite a lot of room in that space, so we can.
Well, if there were 6-inch rafters, which you can get sometimes, or 4-inch, you could maybe put in 3 inches, if you like, of high-performing mineral wool, leaving an inch gap ventilation if you do it carefully, and then put polyurethane or laminated polyurethane boards. Quite often what we've done, if you've got the headroom, is actually to put in 2 inches of polyurethane, then a vapor control layer, and then another layer of polyurethane laminate plasterboard on top of that with long screws all the way through, and then leave that ventilated gap for the that could be filled later if the roof covering was done.
Yeah, that's probably a good option. Because leave it for put that extra bit on later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Jacob. Should we go on to Adrian's question about sash windows? I think you touched on this before, but I think it might be worth a quick word again. So, Adrian, are you there?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Very clearly.
Fantastic.
Yes, so,
You ask, I'm not sure if this is appropriate, but I would how Bill would deal with box sash windows, especially the large void in the waypoint. In terms of thermal, I am unable to replace them for alternative window types, as I am right. Well, you could, Adrian, not saying you should do it, you could replace the windows with a modern sash window with springs.
Yeah. Just conscious that the appearance from the outside may not be the same. I mean, I might be wrong, but
I think that, you know, you can get, depends on is it a conservation area or is it a listed building?
It's not a listed building, it's a conservation area, but the Article 4 means that any replacement windows should be identical to those that are already there.
Can't you argue with them? I mean, that's what...
I'm in a fairly uniform terrace, to be honest, and any difference would be highly noticeable.
Okay. Well, it's very difficult, particularly if you're leaving the sashes in there. Are you thinking of internal wall insulation strategy or not, or just looking at the windows?
No, at the moment, I think our consideration is probably to proceed with wood fibre internal insulation. Okay,
yeah. Well, you could put a secondary glazing system in there internally.
Yeah.
I've seen people be quite radical and put in a tilt and turn window, a complete window, in the same plane, if you like, as the internal wall insulation, the wood fibre board.
Okay. Yeah.
Tilt and turn inward opening window because you can make them quite large, maybe even, you know, a double glazed version, so which are relatively cheap, if you like. Which then allows you opportunity to get in there for ventilation and open up the sashes, and as important, to get in there and clean out all the spiders and condensation mold that will invariably get in there. So
okay.
actually, the box sashes, now you could tape. You're obviously going to, are you leaving the existing plaster on?
Well, at the moment, my intention is actually to replace the sash windows entirely with new sash windows. They will be double glazed, probably with slim light glazing. But I haven't actually looked at going over to spring sashes at the moment.
With springs, then?
Well, I haven't looked at going over to spring sashes at the moment, just because I'm not sure how they would look from the outside. But I've certainly got that option to look at it. But
they won't look any different from the outside.
Okay, well that's perfect then.
Yeah,
so very helpful conversation.
That sort of gives you, because the original one is built in what they call check, that cavity, if you like, where the box sashes went. That means that you can take your wood fibre board around and into the side of the window.
Okay,
so
yeah.
Nice detail, that, because you've got continuity into your window frame of your wood fibre board. Pardon me.
Okay, and then
and air tightness strategy as well. You could tape the window frame, if you like, to the wood fibre board with SL Contiga, for example, which can be plastered over and would make it passive house tight enough as well.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Adrian. Before I go on to any other questions, because I've only got a couple of minutes left to go, what I will say is just a little bit of information for everybody, and that before I wrap up and before people start to leave, and that is to say, just to make you aware or to remind you that the next few modules, the homeworks, we haven't done the new module 4, module 5, module 7 homeworks yet. So the homeworks that are there are for the people who are completing the course, previous runs of the course, and who are still working their way through. So just to avoid confusion, watch out. I will put the new homeworks up for the 2018 group. That's most of you who have started relatively recently. But for people who started back in April 2017 and are still finishing off, there are other homework tasks there in each of the homework the modules with homework. So just be aware of that. There will be 2 different homeworks, and the newest ones aren't ready yet for modules 4, 5 and 7. If you've got any questions, then do ask me if there's any confusion. The other thing to just let you know was there's a very nice webinar about bats and building membranes, which we ran last week, which was open to any AECB members, and that will be put up as a recording if you'd like to find out about that. Quite a lot of surprising information on there, and I think there's going to be a lot more of that in the next few years, perhaps, as we start to see the interaction between bats and some of these roofing membranes.
Yeah.
And of course, I'd also like to thank Bill for doing this presentation and for answering all of his questions, and to thank you for you to coming and listening. Now, if Bill's happy, we'll carry on with the last couple of questions, and if people need to dash off, then that's fine. But we may run over by a minute or 2. Just to get a couple more questions in. Is that okay with you, Bill?
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Well, in that case, well, thank you. That's my spiel for the end of the webinar, but we'll just finish off with a couple of extra questions if we can squeeze them in. So I'll perhaps try and take Thomas's question and Paul Forrester's question. So Thomas, I'll see if I can bring you in, but the question, if you can see it on the screen, is about cavity wall insulation options.
All right. Is Thomas there?
Just bringing him in. Hi, Thomas. I'll just see. I'm not sure if he was one of the person without a mic, so I will just see.
Right.
He can't. Sounds like he may have a microphone problem.
Okay.
I don't think, but if he comes in, he comes in. If not, perhaps that means he can't.
Cavity wall. Which cavity wall insulation method is preferable? Mineral wool fully filled. How about the transgressive dry rain? PIR 50. Right. Okay. I think I've answered this or alluded to it earlier. We come down on the first solution, if you like, number 1. I assume we're talking about new build here, new masonry build. So we're because of thermal bypass, particularly, which is the air movement through and around insulation, rigid batts against the against the inner leaf in the cavity, you invariably get a continuous cavity behind those batts. Quite often those batts aren't taped together well, and they're quite often just shoved in there and they're not continuous, to be quite honest. You've built a ventilated cavity in front of it because you haven't got a vapor open material in the cavity, just for care, and so particularly when you've got a dot and dab plasterboard system inside, we've got just tremendous air movement and just losing heat from the building through the walls, around the insulation and out of the ventilated cavity at the eaves. Now, if you were to use full fill and build it carefully with no mortar droppings in there, and use a wet plaster or parging inside, you've cut down that thermal bypass greatly. Now, the argument about full fill cavity insulation batts are that they're woven vertically, if you like, and are designed to get damp within the first 10-15 mil behind the outer leaf. We've built with this in our passive houses up to 300 mil thick, and with cavity trays at the bottom DPC level, and we haven't run into any moisture problems. In our estimation, cavity wall construction fails with insulation in the cavity, not because of the insulation, but because of badly installed wall ties, cavity trays, and particularly because of mortar droppings in bridging the cavity. When you've got a ventilated cavity, the mortar droppings sometimes can get, well, obviously ventilated, and the moisture doesn't appear to be a problem. As soon as you post-fill it or fill it full of insulation later, it can be a problem because you haven't got that ventilation around it. It's the mortar droppings, not the insulation. Does that answer that question?
I think so, Bill. Thank you. We've run over slightly. Should we just do one last final question with Paul Forrester, and then we'll call it done? Okay.
Is Paul there?
I will just see if I can bring him in. Right. Okay, Paul. Hello. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Ah, hi. Great. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bill. Good to talk to you.
And to you. Right.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realise I'd written quite so much, but it's not a specific question as such. I just the picture of your dormer window in the slide just sort of reminded me of the one in the house where I'm living at the minute, and it's just something I've been aware of as one of the few things I can actually see that will obviously need attention at some point. It's very high up, so external maintenance is almost impossible, and the timber's in a poor condition. And I just wondered what what experiences you'd had with dormer windows like those that you've shown in the presentation.
Well, the drastic way of dealing with it is take it out and put a Velux in.
Yeah.
I've done that many times actually, but of course that alters the appearance greatly of the building, and I can understand why that's not so. What have we done? On that particular dormer, what did we do? We renewed all the timbers outside, and to leave it looking the same. We renewed the roof on top of the dormer, putting slates back on with a vapor open wind-tight membrane running behind the timber cladding, and obviously the slates on top. We then actually, because the cheeks are so narrow, we put in, I think, 75mm timbers. We put in, I think, if we put in, because we put in a good membrane and well taped, we filled it full of the 0.032, the dry therm 32, which is a Knauf product. And then we overboarded, and I think we might have used a space blanket, which is the aerogel product, which has a lambda value approximately twice as good as polyurethane, and then plasterboard over the top, and that's as deep as we could go, actually. So quite extensive.
Do you have many other occasions where you use an aerogel? It's one of the few times I've heard a practical application for it. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, right. And also, I don't know if you were in the beginning of the presentation, I showed you that the weavers' windows that we have round here, where we've got the stone mullions and headers coming right through, and we use it there if the client is willing to get rid of the visual effect of the stone, and either plasterboard or use timbering, go back to the original with space therm underneath. Actually, in the cheeks of your dormer, another way would be to get custom sized VIPS panels, vacuum insulated panels. You can do them. And that the lambda value of that is 0.007, I think, which is 3 times as good as polyurethane, at least, as long as you don't screw through it, of course.
No, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'd not thought of those. That's that's really interesting. Thank you.
That's okay. Pleasure.
Thank you. Okay then, Bill. Well, I think we do have one more question, but perhaps we're a bit out of time. We've run over by about 10 minutes. So what do you want to do? Do you want to call it a day?
Okay. Yeah, I've got to drive down to Dartford now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you everyone for joining in, and hopefully see you at the next webinar, which is at the end of April for Module 4. And if you have other questions or anything that wasn't answered, do put it on the forum, and perhaps we'll get a discussion going between people there.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. and goodbye.